Hi, friends. Welcome to a admittedly late recording of the Cluster Addons call. Today is some day of the month, apparently April 27th. We made it at our normal time on a Tuesday in US time zone. And we've got a bunch of cool friends here from all around the community to sync up and talk Cluster Addons specifics. If you're joining us from YouTube or watching the recording later on, know you're always welcome to hop in the Slack channel and ping us to talk about cool stuff or jump on this call and talk about cool stuff. We've got an agenda item and not much in it for today. So about 40 minutes of unstructured discussion has already occurred since I joined super late. That's on me. And a little bit more of a free-flowing agenda where we usually just take notes, I suppose, since we have no concrete items for today. Does anyone else want to take the floor now on what we've been talking about?
I can briefly, if I recall, we talked a little bit about patch versus update. We talked about OCI images and trying to figure out an appropriate format for wrapping bundles of configuration. And I don't recall if we talked about anything else. Does anyone else recall anything else? Those were the main things. It was pretty unstructured.
Cool. So regarding one on patch versus update, I'm just curious.
We talked about why patch, why update, whether or not it is true that if you use a typed client with update, you're in trouble. We talked if like a field isn't present, does it get dropped?
So this is like client Go details.
In general, like yes, in general, using
Kubernetes API update
API, and then yes, and we also talked a little bit about how apply is now available. Client-side apply is now available as a library, and that same library can also do server-side apply. So that may be a nice way to manage objects from within controllers.
Yeah, certainly I think the ecosystem has gotten to a point where a managed fields style or last applied configuration style apply, either of those tends to be more safe and useful, even though it's way more complicated than the update verb. Interesting. Yeah, I think there's just enough APIs where the structs that you're trying to update are varied and contain information from multiple sources. Like if you don't own an entire struct, an update tends to be a bit dangerous since you have to do a two-phase commit. So the apply is safer in that regard. I guess that, okay, cool discussion on that. Client libraries. And how did we get on that discussion? Ilya, are you like doing something with add-on management and Go code and an operator, or?
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
I see. Likely for popular CNI provider.
Potentially. Yeah. Yeah, we had an internal discussion about how we're going to implement it, and I thought I'd ask here because I kind of lacked some information. And what you just said, Lee, that's interesting. That's something I was missing. That, yeah, I guess if it is something like a deployment or a daemon set, you're likely to encounter, even if you set owner reference, you're likely to encounter other owners poking things into it that you weren't fully aware of.
So the field manager stuff from the new server-side apply and even the old client-side apply with the last applied configuration annotation tend to be like the safest form of appending to a map or something, yeah, or a collection for those complex objects. That makes sense. Otherwise, you risk kind of like overriding things. I don't know if this is really related, but sometimes controllers have patterns where they like copy label updates from parent objects like into child objects, and then that has a consequence of like changing the label selector of like a stateful set or something. We've noticed this in the Flux project, like when we add labels to track garbage collection in a performant way on a high level custom resource, and then those garbage collection labels get copied down to child resources, then say you have a stateful set that ends up like redeploying when it's undesirable because those labels were just for metadata. So interesting controller behaviors to avoid. It's kind of in the same category of gotchas for things that manage other resources. So be selective probably about what labels you move down to child objects. Cool. So regarding OCI image format, how we actually store bundles, there was definitely an effort here to try and come up with a common understanding of how to unpack these things and how to store them. Certainly the Docker registry format or the Docker image format, storing in the registry just as a bunch of tarball layers has been the solution that people have taken with the manifest KEP from the OLM team, trying to make that more standard, as well as basically the image package folks from the Carvel team doing the exact same thing. I'm sorry, I missed this discussion. What else did we talk about there? Is there a good way to store a bunch of config inside of an OCI artifact that's not just abusing the Docker image layers, or is there a standard way of using Docker image layers that isn't super confusing and has additional metadata? Yeah. Cool.
I think we talked about some of the work Nick is planning to do to prototype support for bundle images and various tooling.
Yeah.
I don't think we talked much about the formats themselves. You know,
okay.
OCI and ORAS really is the storing arbitrary artifacts in OCI is the project that standardizes that, and it looks really attractive, but we sort of stayed away because of the runtime concerns.
Yeah, certainly ORAS being used directly in Helm is a very attractive reason to look at doing that. I believe that a lot of folks over in Azure are also using ORAS for other custom media type assembly and various reasons to do that. I think also the, what is it? The CNAB bundles as well, maybe ORAS related. But then you've got over on like is it the containers org, primarily contributed to by Red Hat folks? You have Umaki, I believe, right? UMOCI, and the Builda ecosystem. And then there's the Google container DevTools folks, like with Co and Crane. They have their own layer library as well. And there's a separate library, or no, the Google Containers library is partially used at a higher level inside of the image package code. I guess I should probably write all that down, but yeah. So there's like mainly 3 libraries and then some high level usage that we could learn from inside of image package for unpacking those kinds of things. Also, I learned that the folks who are doing Docker containers as Firecracker VMs at Fly.io, they are using the Docker clients library, or the Docker daemons libraries for unpack.
Some operator framework tooling uses containerd to do unpacking as well. But that's all off cluster.
So 5 enumerated ways of working with manifests. Excellent. Certainly the pattern there is something that we would be interested in supporting for source controller from Flux to do an unpack there. And yeah, I imagine that the most generic unpack available with some slight options to change explicitly based off of the thing that you're pointing at would be powerful enough for the initial use cases, right? Like if you know that you're working with a specific type of image format that needs a different unpack than a Docker image, then you can specify that maybe in the source controllers like OCI image spec. But then like perhaps there's a more powerful heuristic behavior where we could start to pick up on common media types, right? Like with Nick's proposal, if there, is kind of 2 storage mechanisms. One is the Docker image way, and then one has like a specific media type and like uses tarballs or whatever in a simpler way than just Docker images. And that's like indexable with OCI registries that support arbitrary media types, which is basically all of them except for Docker Hub. Then that might be an attractive solution with an alternative heuristic unpack. And that's something that could work for source controller and image package and, all of these other ways of doing things. Cool. Sorry, I missed that discussion. Thanks for catching me up.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that we brought up that we didn't just bring up was whether or not there is a requirement for the node to be the thing that pulls the image as like a baseline everywhere, which discounts any sort of custom media type solution or anything that's like non-conforming to what CRI can unpack.
I see. That's a really good point because yeah, like CRI has up until this point, like only unpacked Docker images and OCI images that are intended to be used as a container runtime or a containers file system. But when we start talking about config images, if we have these arbitrary media types and we want that to be unpackable, like doing that in CRI implies that you could create a container from that config file system. That would be useful for like the CSI volume driver, but maybe it's not that useful for somebody who accidentally puts a config image reference into their deployment. Then you would get a really weird error message or something because there's all of this missing data, that image cannot be created into a container because it doesn't have an entry point and all that. It's missing like a full OCI spec for creating a container.
Yeah, anything the kubelet tries to instantiate, I assume it's only going to check for runnable images and check those like 5 media types, I guess, that are allowed.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if we wanted to be able to support those kinds of arbitrary media types for config images, then the thing that unpacks those images inside of like the kubelet's CRI interface and down into the container runtime, we're talking containerd and cryo, and, any virtual kubelet implementation, all that stuff needs to know how to do this generic unpack, and that is not realistically even for sure going to happen if we agree on as a group that it should be done that way. And even if we could convince everybody, to have the generic unpack supported, or to even convince like a few key players, then it would likely take a while for those things to merge and then percolate into actual clusters. Now, certainly, I think that with the source controller approach in Flux, if we want to be able to support these sorts of arbitrary unpacks and have different drivers, like we can control that thing, and we can have a shared library, right? So that image package and the CSI volume driver potentially as an alternative code path could do these unpacks in a separate process, you know, and there are the concerns about sharing like image auth configurations. If you're in cluster, there's good paths for that. If you're on a node, it's more complicated since the file formats are not, you know, standard, and there's trade-offs there that we've discussed before.
Yeah, so I guess my point here is that if we want to be able to support things like Flux, unpacking these images on cluster with that requirement, then for the immediate future, it discounts doing things with custom media types and sticking to the Docker v22 format,
Yeah.
in OCI or in Docker or whatever.
For like CSI volume driver leveraging kubelet pull, essentially. Am I following you?
Yes, or even implementing in, let's say, Flux, where when you create the repo kind, it goes and generates this thing and sucks it into its HTTP server, and then from some pod that it starts up, I guess.
Yeah,
but,
so if we have the requirement that the node stuff should work either as a soft requirement or as a hard requirement, it affects how we implement the more flexible solution with source controller HTTP server. That's like a huge consideration. That's a really good point. That kind of gets into what Evan and I were talking about. Because I think like last week or the other week, we mentioned that there was a lot of overlap in the purpose and design guidelines that Flux has implemented and where Ruckpack is looking to go. For context, right, Flux fetches sources, it applies them inside the cluster, and it notifies people about the state of those things. And the proposed Ruckpack solution has a few different guidelines, but generally like has some kind of bundle ref to get a source into the cluster, and then a provisioner with a provisioner class style API that can be extended to apply the bundle. And then there's like status updates and things inside of the custom resources. So similar in scope to like what you would want out of Flux, you would want out of Ruckpack. And since we've got these like really well vetted APIs in Flux, it made me wonder what kinds of things in the Ruckpack design could be done to allow for interoperability. Because Flux is very composable, perhaps source controller, since we're talking about supporting OCI bundles and that kind of thing in source controller, and there's already all of these other artifacts that we support, that if Ruckpack provisioners and the Ruckpack bundle API could reference something from source controller, and the provisioners had a library that knew how to fetch things from source controller, then we might have a good way to make these systems come together in a way that would be good for users of both. And yeah, so that's just kind of what we were digging into, the technical details of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Those
personally
are
think there's a lot of opportunity. Unfortunately, I do have to drop to go to another call right now, so can't talk about it today. But we can start a thread in Slack, or we can come back to this.
Yeah, I'd be happy to move those things that we were just happening to DM on into a thread on the Slack. There's nothing necessarily private about them.
Works for
cool. Thanks, friends. Sorry that I joined late and we didn't record more of this. But it's always good to catch up with all of you. Yeah, take care of yourselves, stay healthy.
Thanks for
We'll
recording.
see you all in 2 weeks, if anything. So, yeah, got it.
Thanks.